He didn't call it dinner. He called it fuel. Nat Love. Born into slavery in Tennessee, freed by war, hardened by 10,000 miles of open trail, wrote his autobiography in 1907 with the blunt confidence of a man who had outlasted everything the American West could throw at him. And when he wrote about food, he chose words that still land like a fist on the table. We didn't eat, we refueled, like machines. That single sentence tells you everything you need to know about the cuisine of the cattle drives. Not recipes, not pleasure, not culture. Survival engineering. Executed under open sky with a $40 wagon, a cook who hadn't slept, and 30 men whose lives depended on what came out of that cast iron pot. But here's what Nat Love didn't say, what nobody told you in school, what the Hollywood westerns buried under gunfights and gold rushes. Some of what those cowboys ate has now been rebranded, repackaged, and sold back to Americans at $15 a jar in Whole Foods. And the dish that Eastern journalists in 1880 called barbaric and revolting, the cowboys ate it with a straight face and a quiet pride that said, "You don't understand this land, and you never will." 25 dishes. 25 windows into the most honest, most brutal, most nutritionally ingenious food culture America ever produced. Let's start from the bottom and work our way to the one thing that meant more than cattle, more than money, more even than home. Number 25, jerky. Before protein bars, before the supplement industry, before anyone used the word macros. The Comanche people of the southern plains had already solved the problem of portable, shelf-stable protein. Texan cattle baron Shanghai Pierce, who ran his operation across Matagorda County with the arrogance of a man who owned the horizon, was the first Anglo rancher to industrialize the technique. He borrowed it wholesale from the Comanche and scaled it across his range. 1 ounce of dried beef, 9 grams of protein, 0 grams of carbohydrates. Cowboys carried it in their vest pockets and chewed through 100-mile rides without stopping. This was the world's first performance nutrition, and it predated the protein bar by 100 years. Number 24, cornmeal mush. If jerky was the protein, mush was the foundation. Unglamorous, texturally challenging, relentlessly repetitive. Teddy Blue Abbott, a Montana cowboy who wrote his memoirs under the perfectly American title, "We Pointed Them North," remembered the blizzard of 1878 on the Kansas plains. His crew was pinned down for 3 days. The cattle were gone. The supply wagon was frozen. What kept 14 men alive? A bag of cornmeal and a pot of boiling water. He wrote about it, not with resentment, but with the reverence of a man who understands what the alternative looks like. Medical science would later confirm what those men already knew. Cornmeal is dense with niacin, vitamin B3, the absence of which causes pellagra, a disease that killed thousands across the American South during the same era. The cowboys on the trail, eating their unworthy bowl of mush, were protected by accident. Number 23, chuck wagon chili. There is a war about this dish that has never officially ended. Ab Blocker, trail boss of legendary status, a man who pushed cattle from Texas to Montana season after season with the precision of a military general, had a rule so simple it became doctrine: no beans in the chili. Beans in chili, he reportedly said, are put there by cowards. The roots of this dish lie not in Anglo-Texas kitchens, but in San Antonio, where Mexican vaqueros had long combined dried chili peppers with beef in a way that solved a very specific problem. Dried chili contains capsaicin, a natural antimicrobial compound. In a world without refrigeration, under a Texas sun, that pepper wasn't seasoning. It was chemistry. It kept meat safe long enough to eat. Number 22, son of a gun stew. Charles Siringo, the first cowboy to ever write an autobiography, published in 1885 before anyone thought a cowboy's story was worth publishing, called this stew the honest food of honest men. The ingredients read like a challenge: heart, liver, tongue, brain, sweetbreads. Everything the rancher's wife would have set aside. Everything the Eastern tourist would have refused. The cowboys wasted nothing. Not because they were noble, but because they were practical. Modern nutritional analysis confirms what they intuitively understood. A single serving of organ-based stew delivers the complete daily requirement of vitamin A, vitamin B12, and iron. A nutritional profile that muscle meat alone simply cannot match. Number 21. Sourdough biscuits. A cook known only as Sourdough Sam, working the Goodnight Loving Trail in the early 1870s, slept with his sourdough crock tucked under his blanket every night. Not sentiment, not superstition, pure science. The lactobacillus cultures that give sourdough its rise die below freezing, and on the staked plains of Texas, winter temperatures drop to -10 degrees Celsius without apology. When Sam's culture finally died in the winter of 1872, his crew of 14 men spent 3 days eating hardtack and silence. Sourdough biscuits were not bread. They were morale. Number 20. Vinegar pie. Oliver Loving, the senior partner of the Goodnight Loving Trail, a man whose name now marks over 2,000 miles of American cattle history, once paid his camp cooks double wages if they could produce this pie in field conditions. The recipe requires no citrus, no dairy, no fresh fruit, apple cider vinegar, sugar, eggs, and a prayer. The result, by all contemporary accounts, tasted remarkably like lemon custard. What those cooks didn't know, and what biochemists would confirm a century later, is that acetic acid in apple cider vinegar slows the absorption of sugar into the bloodstream. They had, entirely by accident, invented a low glycemic dessert in 1868. Number 19. Pan de campo. This flatbread belongs to a lineage older than the cattle drives, older than Texas statehood. The Caros from Laredo carried this recipe across generations the way other families carry surnames. No yeast, no rising time. 20 minutes from flour to fire to table, baked flat against a hearthstone. The secret ingredient, lard rendered pork fat, was for a century condemned by American nutritionists as the enemy of the heart. Research over the past 2 decades has quietly walked that verdict back. Lard is primarily monounsaturated fat, the same class of fat celebrated in Mediterranean olive oil. The dangerous food of the frontier was, it turns out, one of the more sensible fats in the 19th century American diet. The cook was more important than the Sheriff John Slaughter, cowboy, cattleman, and eventually Sheriff of Cochise County, Arizona. Was a man who understood the mathematics of the trail better than almost anyone. His exchange rate was public knowledge. A good cook, I'd trade for 3 cowboys, and I wouldn't negotiate. The chuck wagon was not a kitchen. It was civilization on wheels. It carried castor oil and turpentine alongside the coffee and cornmeal. It was the camp pharmacy, the tool depot, and the single point of warmth in a world that offered very little of it. The cook rose at 3 in the morning. He did not sleep until past midnight. His mood was the barometer for the entire drive. A sullen cook produced sullen cowboys, and sullen cowboys made mistakes. Cheerful food, bear sign fresh from the fat, spotted pup with real molasses, could carry a crew through river crossings and storm fronts that should have broken them. The sheriff had a gun. The cook had something more powerful, the ability to make 30 exhausted men feel, for 15 minutes around a fire, that they were somewhere worth being. Number 18. Salt pork and beans. Nat Love kept count. Over the course of 1880, he recorded eating pinto beans on 312 separate days. The salt pork came by barrel from Kansas City. 12 cents per pound, one barrel lasting a crew of 8 for a month. Eastern food critics of the era dismissed this combination as the diet of poverty. What they missed, what Mesoamerican civilizations had understood for thousands of years, is that pinto beans combined with corn create a complete protein, delivering every essential amino acid the human body requires. The Cowboys weren't eating poverty food. They were eating the most efficient protein engine ever assembled from 2 cheap ingredients. Number 17. Stewed dried apples. Teddy Blue Abbott wrote that the smell of cinnamon and stewed apple drifting across an open prairie could stop an argument mid-sentence. Men went quiet. They remembered kitchens. They remembered women. They remembered states they'd left behind. For 10 cents per pound, the cook delivered something no salary could buy: a moment of home in the middle of nothing. Dried apples retain roughly 85% of the fiber and iron present in fresh fruit. Drying doesn't diminish the apple, it concentrates it. Number 16. Fried salt pork with red-eye gravy. Ab Blocker imposed this as a formal rule. After any day covering more than 20 miles on horseback, the morning meal must include red-eye gravy. The recipe is 2 ingredients: coffee and pan drippings. Nothing more. The caffeine hit was real, but it came delivered inside fat, which slows gastric absorption. Cowboys on those mornings were getting what modern sports science now calls a slow-release stimulant. Sustained energy across the first 4 hours of riding, rather than a spike and collapse. Number 15. Hardtack. The cracker that refused to die. Veterans of Gettysburg, men who had carried these dense flour and water biscuits through 3 days of the bloodiest engagement on American soil, brought the recipe west into civilian life. Charles Siringo described the sound of hardtack breaking against a tin plate at a night camp as the music of hunger. 1 cracker, 75 calories, 0 moisture. The complete absence of water is the reason hardtack found in Civil War-era earthworks 20 years after the conflict was reportedly still edible. Not pleasant, but edible. Number 14. Coffee gravy. Oliver Loving died on the trail in 1867, far from home, from wounds he could not outrun. The accounts of his final hours are sparse. What survives is one detail, passed between cowboys across decades of retelling. The last thing he asked for, though, was a biscuit with coffee gravy. That gravy, coffee-thickened pan fat poured over sourdough biscuit, became something mythological in the years that followed. Every cowboy who outlived that era and eventually settled into a house with a real kitchen made this dish. Not because it was great food, because it was their food. Number 13. Bear sign, donuts. The rumor traveled faster than any cattle. If word reached a distant pasture that the chuck wagon cook was frying bear sign, cowboys galloped in from miles out, cutting short their afternoon work without apology. Shanghai Pierce remembered the scene. Grown men in spurs and trail dust, waiting like children outside a birthday party. Donuts fried in lard, rolled in sugar, while still hot. In the 1880s, refined sugar cost the equivalent of a full day's wages per pound. A batch of bear sign wasn't a snack. It was a bonus, a celebration, a signal that, at least for one evening, the trail was giving something back. Science confirms the ancestors. In 2020, researchers affiliated with Harvard Medical School published findings on what they termed nose-to-tail eating patterns. The practice of consuming organ meats, bone material, and connective tissue alongside muscle meat. The findings were striking. This dietary pattern, which nutritional modernism had spent decades dismissing as primitive, provided a complete amino acid profile that selective muscle meat diets simply cannot replicate. Nat Love lived to 67 years. He walked more miles in harsher conditions, on less sleep, with less medical support than any modern athlete preparing for an endurance event. He did it on jerky, beans, organ stew, sourdough biscuit, and black coffee. He did not know the word nutritiology. He did not track his macros. He did not own a not track his macros. He did not own a supplement. He just didn't throw anything away. That discipline, the radical, unromantic practice of using every part of everything, was not poverty. It was intelligence. The kind of intelligence that gets worked out not in the laboratories, but over open fire, on moving ground, in the dark, when the alternative to creativity is going without. The Cowboys didn't build a cuisine. They built a system. And in the 12 dishes still to come, from prairie oysters to spotted pup, to the thing that mattered more than cattle, more than land, more than anything the West could take from you, that system is going to reveal something about America that we've spent 150 years trying to forget. There is a moment that happens on every long trail. Historians rarely record it, but the Cowboys who lived through it never forgot it. It arrives somewhere around the 40th or 50th day. The land stops being scenery. The cattle stop being cargo. The fire stops being warmth. Everything compresses into function, into rhythm, into the pure stripped mechanics of keeping moving. And then the cook does something unexpected. He pulls out a secret sack of raisins, or he finds an onion that survived 3 weeks in a saddlebag, or he boils a bone he's been saving since the last slaughter into something golden and trembling in the pot. And 30 men, leathered, exhausted, past the point where sentiment seems available, go quiet in a way that has nothing to do with hunger. That is the moment this second half of our story is about. Not survival anymore. Something deeper. The moment when food stopped being fuel and started being identity. Number 12. Fried calf brain. Bill Pickett was a man who redefined what was possible. Born in 1870 to a formerly enslaved father in Travis County, Texas, he became one of the most celebrated rodeo performers in American history. The inventor of a steer wrestling technique called bulldogging that required a level of physical courage that spectators came from 3 states away to witness. He described fried calf brain in the accounts that survive him as a Sunday delicacy, the thing the cook produced on days when the drive had gone well. The texture, by contemporary description, sits somewhere between crème brûlée and warm butter. The flavor is mild, almost sweet. Eastern food critics of the era wrote about it with theatrical horror. Bill Pickett ate it with quiet satisfaction, the way a man eats something he has earned. Modern nutritional science has since confirmed what Pickett's body understood. Brain tissue contains the highest concentration of DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, an omega-3 fatty acid, of any food source on Earth. The same compound now sold in amber capsules for $30 a bottle. Number 11. Corn dodgers. Jesse Chisholm never set out to be immortal. He was a mixed-heritage Cherokee trader and scout who cut a path through the Indian Territory of present-day Oklahoma in 1867 purely for commercial reasons, following the natural contours of the land to move his supply wagons south. Cowboys adopted that path, then more cowboys, then the entire cattle industry. The Chisholm Trail moved an estimated 5 million head of cattle over the following 2 decades, and Jesse Chisholm's name became synonymous with the American West. On his scouting expeditions, solo or nearly so, he carried corn dodgers in his coat pockets, dense unleavened cakes of cornmeal formed by hand and fried in a dry pan. 3 or 4 would last a man 2 days. Cornmeal contains no gluten, requires no yeast, and costs half what wheat flour demanded on the frontier market. A century and a half before gluten-free became a grocery store category, Jesse Chisholm was living the concept out of pure logistical necessity. Number 10. Canned tomatoes. The 1870s changed everything. Not the railroad, though the railroad mattered. Not the Winchester repeating rifle, though that mattered too. What changed the nutritional reality of the cattle drive was a tin can. Ab blocker, trail boss, pragmatist, man of very few wasted words, added canned tomatoes to his mandatory supply list after 1872 and refused to run a drive without them. His crew fought over the last can the way other men fight over money. The reason was not sentiment. After 60 days without fresh produce, the human body begins to break down. Vitamin C deficiency produces fatigue first, then joint pain, then gum disease, then systemic collapse, what sailors called scurvy, and what Blocker simply called a dead cowboy. Those cans prevented it. What neither Blocker nor his crew knew was the secondary benefit that modern nutritional research has since documented. Lycopene, the compound that gives tomatoes their color, is absorbed by the body 3 to 4 times more effectively from cooked and processed tomatoes than from raw ones. The act of canning, entirely by accident, had made the tomato more nutritious than it was fresh. Number 9. Skunk egg stew. The name was affectionate in the way that only men who respect something name it after something terrible. Skunk eggs was trail slang for onions, and Charles Siringo, who documented cowboy life with the unsentimental precision of a man who had actually lived it rather than romanticized it, wrote about the cook who hid his onion supply inside the saddle pile to protect it from theft. Not from outsiders, from his own crew. Men who had been riding for weeks without fresh vegetables would slide off their horses at camp, drift casually toward the chuck wagon, and attempt to quietly extract an onion from the stores. The cook knew every trick. The stew itself, onions, potato, trail-cut beef, simmered until everything surrendered into one soft mass, was more than food. Modern biochemistry has since identified quercetin, a natural anti-inflammatory compound found in high concentrations in onions, as a significant inhibitor of the muscle inflammation pathways that activate after sustained physical exertion. 12 hours in the saddle, every day, for months. A bowl of onion stew at the end of it was, without anyone using the word, recovery nutrition. Number 8. Prairie oysters. Every spring, across the ranches of Texas and later Colorado, came branding season. The most labor-intensive, most physically demanding stretch of the cattle year. Bill Pickett was a regular presence at these events, and the dish that appeared at the branding fire was one that Eastern journalists visiting the frontier wrote about with a kind of scandalized wonder that says more about their own limitations than about the food. Prairie oysters, the byproduct of the castration process that produced steers suitable for the beef market, were cleaned, seasoned, and fried quickly over high heat. The cowboys ate them without ceremony or explanation. Today, a festival in Rocky Ford, Colorado, celebrates this tradition and draws 10,000 attendees annually. The nutritional profile, had anyone bothered to analyze it at the time, would have been striking. Concentrated zinc, essential for immune function and cellular repair. Exactly what the body requires during periods of maximum physical output. The cowboys didn't know the mechanism. They understood the effect. Arbuckles, the first corporate brand of the frontier. Nat Love mentions it 11 times in his autobiography. 11. No dish, no person, no place on the trail receives that frequency of reference. Not cattle, not guns, not money, coffee. Specifically, Arbuckles' Ariosa. Coffee, the roasted sugar-glazed whole bean product that the Arbuckle brothers of Pittsburgh had engineered specifically to survive the transit from East Coast roastery to frontier chuck wagon without going stale. Cowboys consumed it in quantities that defy modern imagination. Up to 1 gallon per man per day across the length of a drive. The grinding was done by hand at the wagon, and the Arbuckle brothers, with a genius for marketing that belongs in the history books alongside Edison and Carnegie, included a single peppermint candy in every package, 1 piece, earned by whoever ground the beans. Teddy Blue Abbott remembered it clearly, writing decades later that men who had been in the saddle for 14 consecutive hours would argue loudly, creatively, and with complete conviction over the right to grind the coffee and claim that candy. The physiology was real. Caffeine has since been shown to improve endurance performance by 12 to 15% in sustained aerobic effort. The Arbuckle brothers, pursuing a commercial opportunity in a market with no competition, had accidentally formulated the first sports performance beverage in American history. They sold it for 15 cents a pound. Number 7. Spotted pup. Rice, raisins, molasses. Milk, if available, canned usually, powdered when necessary. Oliver Loving, the elder statesman of the Goodnight Loving Trail, the man whose partnership with Charles Goodnight opened 800 miles of cattle country, is said to have held that a cook who could produce spotted pup in the field was worth 2 who could not. The name came from the visual, the raisins scattered through the white rice pudding, dark spots on a pale surface, thick enough when done that a wooden spoon stood upright in the pot unaided. Cowboys described it the way men describe things that carry memory, not in terms of taste, but in terms of what it returned to them. Warmth, sweetness, the sensation of being cared for by someone who had the skill and the intention to care. Raisins, it turns out, contain iron and boron, the latter a trace mineral that improves the body's ability to absorb calcium and magnesium, both of which are depleted by sustained heavy physical labor. The dessert that felt like a luxury was, quietly, also medicine. Number 6. Molasses. Shanghai Pierce. 6 feet 4 inches of Texas opinion, a man who once described himself as the cattle king of the Gulf Coast, without apparent irony, transported molasses by the barrel. His cooks guarded it with the same vigilance they gave to the cash box. It went on everything: biscuits, beans, cornmeal mush, the morning's pan de campo, the evening's spotted pup. Sweet, viscous, nearly black, it was the flavor that unified the whole diet of the trail. Sorghum molasses, the variety most commonly available to frontier cooks, contains more iron per tablespoon than an equivalent weight of raw spinach. The cooking syrup that nutritional culture would later dismiss as empty sweetness was, in its frontier context, the most mineral-dense condiment on the wagon. Number 5. Biscuits and gravy. Charles Siringo was not a sentimental man. His prose has the quality of inventory, factual, dry, precise, which makes this observation land harder than almost anything else in his writing. A good cook makes biscuits 3 times a day. A bad cook makes them once and regrets it. The dish itself, flour biscuit, pork fat gravy seasoned with black pepper and pan drippings, is now the anchor of the Southern American breakfast table from Texas to Tennessee. It survived the cattle drives, outlasted the frontier, crossed into the permanent food culture of the nation. The nutritional reality is that fat-based gravy slows the absorption of the biscuit's starch into the bloodstream, not by design, but by chemistry. Cowboys eating this breakfast at 4 a.m. were receiving stable, sustained energy across 4 to 5 hours of riding before the next meal. The body didn't spike. the body held. That mattered on a day that would ask everything of it. Number 4. Peco strawberries. Beans. Nat Love kept that count. 312 days of pinto beans in a single year. He named them Peco strawberries. Trail humor, dry as the country itself. The joke that acknowledged the distance between what you wished for and what you had. He wrote it without complaint. We called them strawberries. It helped. 15 grams of protein per serving at a cost of pennies per pound. Combined with the corn in the cornbread that always accompanied them, pinto beans deliver a complete essential amino acid profile, every building block the body needs for muscle repair and cellular function. Mesoamerican civilizations had discovered this combination thousands of years before any nutritionist published a paper on protein complementarity. The Cowboys didn't know the science. They knew the math. Cheap, filling, and you could carry enough in a single sack to feed 8 men for a month. Number 3. Hangtown Fry. March of 1850. Placerville, California. Then known with the unadorned honesty of Gold Rush naming conventions as Hangtown. A miner named Tom Hughes walked into the El Dorado Hotel with a nugget in his hand and a request that has become one of the origin stories of American restaurant culture. He wanted the most expensive meal the kitchen could assemble. The cook produced oysters, shipped in salt water from the San Francisco Bay, fried with bacon and eggs. The price was the equivalent of a week's wages. Hughes paid it. The dish moved east with the men who returned from California, carried in the memory of anyone who had tasted it, and eventually found its way into the rotation of chuck wagon cooks who could source oysters near coastal or river routes. One serving of oysters contains more bioavailable zinc than any other food source on record, a single plate closing what would otherwise be a week's nutritional deficit. Number 2. Bone marrow soup. Charles Goodnight, the architect of the trail, the man who designed the chuck wagon itself, who understood cattle movement, the way engineers understand load-bearing structures, gave one standing order after every slaughter: the bones do not leave the camp. They went into the pot, broken and cracked to release the marrow, boiled for hours over low heat until the liquid ran the color of amber and carried a weight and richness that plain water never approached. This broth went to the men who were sick, to the men who had been hurt, to anyone the cook judged to be running low. Modern research has documented what Goodnight practiced empirically. The collagen compounds released from slow-cooked bones support cartilage repair, reduce systemic inflammation, and improve joint resilience. Brands now sell this product, labeled bone broth in tasteful packaging, for $40 per liter. Goodnight made it from the parts he refused to throw away. Number 1. Coffee and whatever's left. Teddy Blue Abbott was 80 years old when he finished writing his memoir. The drives were 50 years gone. The cattle were long since sold. The trail bosses buried. The chuck wagons rotted back into the earth. He had outlived almost everyone he'd ridden with. And near the end of the book, he wrote the sentence that is the true number 1 on this list. Not a dish, but a philosophy. The cattle could end. The money could end. But if the coffee ended, that was the end of everything. He wasn't talking about caffeine. He was talking about the thing that the coffee represented. The minimum viable thread of civilization in the middle of nothing. The proof that someone had planned ahead, that someone cared enough to load the arbuckles before anything else. Every dish on this list is a variation of the same statement. No beans, use corn. No corn, use hardtack. No hardtack, boil the bones. No bones, drink your coffee and keep moving. This is not a culinary tradition. This is an ethic. You use what you have. You waste nothing. You feed the people next to you before you feed yourself. America has spent 150 years mythologizing the cowboy's gun, his horse, his hat, his code of silence in the face of danger. What it has almost entirely forgotten is his kitchen, and what that kitchen said about who he was when no one was watching. The thread that still holds somewhere in Dallas today, there is a family descended from Nat Love, not a myth, a documented lineage, and by multiple accounts that have circulated in American heritage communities for decades. That family still makes spotted pup for Thanksgiving. Rice, raisins, molasses. The wooden spoon standing straight in the pot. It takes less than 45 minutes. It costs almost nothing. It has no Instagram aesthetic, no artisan credentials, no farm-to-table provenance that a food magazine would bother photographing. It is just warm, sweet, speckled rice pudding, made the way a chuck wagon cook made it in 1880 with whatever he had left at the end of a hard day. And yet it carries, in every bowl, the entire weight of a life that most of us could not have survived for a week. The trail, the miles, the cold, the distances, the silence. The community of exhausted men around a fire who needed, more than meat or bread, or even coffee, to feel that someone had taken the trouble to make something good. So here is the question this story ends on. And it is not a rhetorical one. Does your family have a recipe like that? Something that came from somewhere hard, a migration, a difficult season, a generation that made do and made it matter. A dish that carries a history your grandmother knew but never fully explained? Because that is the real inheritance of the frontier. Not the gun, not the land, the knowledge, passed hand to hand across 150 years, of how to feed the people you love with whatever you have left. That knowledge is still worth more than anything Whole Foods is selling.